Good morning and welcome to Rising. Nice to have you back in the flesh, Jessica.
It's good to finally be here against all odds.
Yes, your travels were difficult.
Terrible, terrible. Getting on a plane is a scary feat these days in America. I've spent like over 10 hours in the Chicago airport Sunday and today, or last night.
Well, your commitment to eventually making it here to help me explain the news to people is admirable, and we appreciate it. What are we talking about today?
With 90 days to go before the election, the Democratic ticket is set. Kamala Harris and her vice presidential pick, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, strutted across a stage in front of jam-packed Temple University Arena in Philadelphia Tuesday night. The pair highlighting one message: we're not going back. Harris was greeted with roaring cheers of excitement as she previewed what to expect from a Harris-Walz administration, and letting the crowd know Walz is the kind of vice president America deserves. Here are some moments from her speech. Let's watch.
Good to be back in Pennsylvania. And our campaign is not just a fight against Donald Trump. Our campaign, this campaign, is a fight for the future. It's a fight for the future. In Pennsylvania, we fight for a future with affordable housing, affordable health care, affordable child care, paid leave. We fight for a future where we build a broad-based economy, where every American has the opportunity to own a home, to start a business, and to build wealth. Well, Tim and I have a message for Trump and others who want to turn back the clock on our fundamental freedoms. We're not going back.
Walz held his own, unleashing attacks on Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Let's watch.
Some of us are old enough to remember when it was Republicans who were talking about freedom. It turns out now what they meant was the government should be free to invade your doctor's office. In Minnesota, we respect our neighbors and their personal choices that they make. Even if we wouldn't make the same choice for ourselves, there's a golden rule: mind your own damn business. Violent crime was up under Donald Trump. That's not even counting the crimes he committed. And I got to tell you, I can't wait to debate the guy. That is, if he's willing to get off the couch and show up.
Team Trump wasted no time, however, in firing back at Harris and Walz. Vance made the rounds in the hours following this pick. Let's watch.
It just highlights how radical Kamala Harris is. This is a person who listened to the Hamas wing of her own party and selecting a nominee. This is a guy who's proposed shipping more manufacturing jobs to China, who wants to make the American people more reliant on garbage energy instead of good American energy, and has proposed defunding the police just as Kamala Harris does. I think it's interesting, actually. They make an interesting tag team because, of course, Tim Walz allowed rioters to burn down Minneapolis in the summer of 2020, and then the few who got caught, Kamala Harris helped bail them out of jail. So it is more instructive for what it says about Kamala Harris, that she doesn't care about the border, she doesn't care about crime, she doesn't care about American energy, and most importantly, she doesn't care about the Americans who have been made to suffer under those policies.
Yeah, so as we've been covering so far this week, this is a vice presidential pick that has ironically seemed to have made everyone happy because the left, progressives, feel energized by the pick because he is someone closer to their ideology to your ideology, I think you would say. You've been a fan of his, versus the other picks. And then also the right now thinks they actually have someone to run against. Donald Trump has said, I was just watching an interview he did, I think, with Fox and Friends this morning, where he said he was surprised. He can't believe they picked him, and he's happy about it because Republicans think they'll be able to run more effectively against him. So I guess it's exciting all the way around.
I think it's interesting that Vance seemingly is not a fan of Walz when Donald Trump himself appointed Tim Walz to his Council of Governors. And I think that speaks to the fact that Tim Walz's vision for America is one of unity, is one of delivering on policy for working class and middle class people. That's why I like him as someone who grew up in a working family. And I think that he's not a surprising pick if we imagine the person who's picked is always the person who's best for the job. And I think many people are surprised because Democrats haven't always gone that route. And so I'm pleasantly surprised. I think he's very charming. I was scribbling in my notebook that I didn't notice the first time I watched the clip, but the way he claps along with everyone is very adorable. He just has the energy in the room of people clapping, and he's just like, yay, we're all happy and having a good time. I think he's just a charming, regular guy on top of being a very effective governor.
I'll admit I don't find him particularly charming. I actually find, I can't believe I'm about to say this, but I find Kamala Harris likable in comparison, which is not a sentence I ever thought I would say. But she seems to me to be the more ideologically centrist or flexible of the two. I will note, so also in this Fox and Friends interview Donald Trump did this morning, he said that the only interaction he had with Tim Walz, other than picking him to that, you're correct that he picked him to some governor's council, he said that Tim Walz called him in 2020, did you see this? When there were pro-Trump protesters outside his house, and this is according to Trump, Tim Walz asked Trump, could you say something so that these protesters go away? And Trump says he did, that he put out the word, this is all according to Trump, I put out the word, I said, he's a good person, I hope everything's good. And the MAGA protesters put down their flags and went home, and Tim Walz called him back and said, thank you very much for doing that. And that's the only interaction they've ever had. I don't know that it, I don't know, it's interesting.
Yeah, Donald Trump's known to lie, though, right? So they've probably talked.
Well, I don't know that it didn't happen. Well, I don't even know that it makes Trump look particularly good. I mean, there was a mob of pro-Trump people outside the guy's house at Trump's, who only would go home after Trump asked them to. It's not an anecdote that's made to make Walz look bad or Trump look good.
So what does that
it's
mean?
just a funny
Trump never
anecdote.
met with his Council of Governors when he was president? That's what we are supposed to believe? If that's true, that's not very good for Trump.
I don't know I don't know what the Council of Governors role actually is. If it was a ceremonial role, if it was something the president is involved in.
It's probably important the president knows what's going on in the country, though, right? There are certain things the governor knows that the people in the media don't know.
Sure.
Right. Anyway, I think Walz has done great. Kamala has such a good pick. In a lot of their interactions, it seems that this is a relationship where Kamala and Walz genuinely get along. She genuinely likes this guy. And it makes sense as to why. He's someone that's very likable, very popular. There's all these attacks saying he's creepy, which is hilarious because, as J.D. Vance is being labeled a weirdo, young people love Walz. By many people. Many people are saying this, Robby. I'm saying this. I think he's a little bit weird.
Many people are saying Walz is a left-wing radical ideologue. Many people are saying many things.
Yeah, and I think Walz is a great guy to just say, people are screaming about socialism, we just build roads and schools. People want the government to function, and Tim Walz is popular in his state because he's gotten the government to function. I think that's a great pick for someone to be the vice president, someone who has a track record of getting things done. So many times we have people who are appointed who are venture capitalists in the case of J.D. Vance, someone whose background is being a lawyer, career politicians. Right. He was a teacher. He took an O in 2017 and in 3 years made that football team state champions. This is a guy who can turn stuff around. I love Tim Walz.
Yeah, I can tell we're going to end up having this argument many times in the,
Robby loves
coming
football.
weeks. I'm thankful for his contributions to his football team, and look, he seems like a likable enough guy, I guess. I find his policies very off-putting, and we'll see how they're received by working people, especially in terms of the energy and environmental mandates that will become even more stringent under the leadership of Democrats. But we'll see how that sell goes. It's clear that the Democrats are very excited about this pick and think they will have a very strong case to make to the American public. It's interesting because he doesn't look, so he looks older than he is. And, if Kamala Harris were to win, but he's only 60, Kamala Harris were to win and serve for 8 years, and then we could have, he would run, and he would be, it's hard to predict so far in the future, but he would certainly be a top potential person to be a successor to her as her VP. The VP usually seeks higher office. So it could be, if they win, it could be Kamala Harris and then Tim Walz for the next 16 years.
You know what I think is interesting?
Mayor Pete's got to be upset about that. Anyway, go ahead.
So it's kind of an admission, Trump saying that that's the only time he had like a one-to-one conversation with Walz. Because if we remember, in June of 2020, Donald Trump said on Twitter, quote, he forced Democrat-run Minnesota to bring the National Guard and end rioting and looting after seeing the destruction and crime in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Now, a paper trail shows emails of Walz, days before Trump ever spoke about this, calling in the National Guard. On the 27th, he had a conversation with the mayor about it. On the 28th, they were ordered in. Mm-hmm. That night is the night the precinct burned, after Tim Walz called in the National Guard. And a lot of people have been saying things happen in the reverse order. A lot of people are also still believing this lie that Donald Trump told Tim Walz to do it. There is no record of that ever happening.
Okay.
Donald Trump said this after Walz had already called in the Guard. And so, he's kind of admitting that this conversation he tweeted about in June of 2020 never happened.
What conversation? Where
He said that he forced the Minnesota governor to call in the National Guard.
Yeah, I think he was just saying this morning that the only time they've ever spoken directly was when Tim Walz begged him to get crazy MAGA people to stop protesting in front of his house.
So then...
And Trump very kindly agreed to do that. What a guy.
Yeah, and Donald Trump only ever spoke publicly about the need for the National Guard to be there after Walz had already ordered them in, according to the emails.
Well, today my radar is aimed at Tim Walz's COVID record, which I was not a fan of. You will want to watch that. Maybe I'll subsequently do one, or you can do one, or we can cover it together and look more closely at the timeline of the National Guard coming in.
Yeah, we could produce a story together on what happened. Instead of doing a
get to the
radar where
bottom
we're
of it.
mad about COVID and we find what Tim Walz did that coincides with what we're mad about.
You're going to be mad. I'm going to be mad. Stay tuned. It should get shouty. More Rising right after this.
But we can get out there, reach out, make the case. And for one thing, don't ever shy away from our progressive values. One person's socialism is another person's neighborliness. Just do the damn work. So I got to tell you, when I see this, it lifts me up. I'm inspired. I see it.
Another notable thing about Walz is that he served as governor during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's thus possible to parse his approach to the virus, and that record is extremely disturbing. Indeed, Walz's coronavirus policies were extremely heavy-handed and restrictive. Under his leadership, the state endured the pandemic in a fundamentally anti-libertarian fashion. Now, when the coronavirus was first spreading, Walz was an enthusiastic promoter of social distancing rules. He described the crowds in public outdoors spaces as a little too big. He even defended Minnesota's ridiculous hotline for COVID-19 snitches. That's right, Walz's government maintained a method for people to report their neighbors for failing to abide by social distancing rules. Walz insisted in that recent interview we just played that one person's socialism is another person's neighborliness. Well, denouncing one's neighbors as insufficiently loyal to government policies is, I suppose, his idea of neighborliness. Now, when asked by Republicans to take down that hotline, Walz responded, "We're not going to take down a phone number that people can call to keep their families safe." Though Walz instructed police to merely issue merely issue citations to people caught violating stay-at-home orders, which is still bad enough in my view. He also maintained the right via executive order to issue $1,000 fines and send violators to jail for 90 days. Now, his government maintained that private indoor gatherings should be limited to 10 people. Outdoor gatherings were arbitrarily capped at 25 people. That's just the science. On July 23, 2020, Walz declared a statewide mask mandate for most indoor spaces and even some outdoor spaces. Quote, if we can get a 90 to 95% compliance, which we've seen, the science shows we can reduce the infection rate dramatically, which slows that spread and breaks that chain, Walz said at the time. This is the way, the cheapest, the most effective way for us to open up our businesses, for us to get our kids back in school, for us to keep our grandparents healthy, and for us to get back to the life we all miss so much. Now, what followed was the implementation of one of the stupidest COVID-19 rules of all. Diners at restaurants had to wear masks while walking to their table, you remember this, and moving about the establishment, but were of course allowed to go maskless as long as they were eating and drinking, as if COVID cares what activity you're engaged in. Now, later in November and December of 2020, Walz issued and extended orders for restaurants, gyms, and other businesses to shut down. This included outdoor dining service for eating establishments. Now, over 150 businesses formed the Reopen Minnesota Coalition and urged the governor to relent, but Walz was unmoved. By the spring of 2021, vaccines were widely available for the most at-risk groups, and people who wanted to protect themselves from the risk of severe disease and death were able to exercise that option. It was only at this point that Walz partly relented and allowed widespread reopening. However, he kept capacity limits in place for many businesses. These nonsensical policies, the efficacy of which is now doubted by top U.S. health officials, with everyone, including Anthony Fauci, saying the 6 feet of social distancing rule was made up on the spot. This is not unique to Minnesota. In fact, these rules were commonplace in blue states all over the country. But Walz was as vigorous an enforcer of them as any of his Democratic peers. He was also one of the foremost defenders of a monstrous COVID-19 policy choice, sending sick, elderly patients back to nursing homes where the infection often spread to other vulnerable people, causing a disproportionate number of coronavirus deaths in such settings. This has been well covered by the media. Now, a cover-up of the nursing home deaths in New York actually brought an end to the political ambitions of one Governor Andrew Cuomo, who lied about his involvement in this policy in order to sell more books. But Walz was a fellow practitioner of this policy. In fact, Walz said it was, quote, not a mistake to release sick people back to nursing homes. That statement alone reflects poor enough judgment as to be disqualifying for the pursuit of higher office. Pandemic policies are not nearly as salient today as they were 2 years ago, and so it remains to be seen whether Walz's record here matters much to voters. But for anyone who considers the COVID-19 restrictions to have been the biggest assault on liberties in our lifetime, as I do, Walz's VP candidacy should be a non-starter. Can liberty-conscious Americans really afford to sign off on a presidential ticket in which one of the people on that ticket implemented most, if not all, of the very worst, most egregiously authoritarian pandemic policies? Of course not. Now, Kamala Harris could have picked a Democratic governor whose COVID approach was more relaxed, more sane. That option was available. There's Colorado Governor Jared Polis, for instance, who actually canceled his state's COVID executive orders earlier than other governors. He declined to reinstitute a mask mandate when cases surged during subsequent waves, and there was pressure to do so. And he told the media that he didn't think people could, quote, be expected to live in an emergency state for years on end. Kamala Harris also could have picked someone who wasn't the executive of a state during the pandemic and whose record would at least be uncertain. Unfortunately, there's nothing uncertain about Tim Walz.
Robby, I'm curious if you think that some of the social distancing guidelines that Walz created, the hotline for people to report, that happened March 31st of 2020. Donald Trump was president. He was the person who appointed Fauci. It was his CDC and his guidelines that informed states just 3 days before Tim Walz was talking about this hotline, because people were reported to all be not social distancing at the public lakes of Minnesota. March 28th, 2020, the federal guidelines, this is from a White House press release, to prevent the spread of COVID-19, the White House extends all social distancing measures until through the end of April 2020. So Tim Walz was just enforcing Trump's policies during COVID. That's all he was doing as governor. So should he have not followed the guidelines of Donald Trump as president?
Well, Donald Trump didn't specifically tell him to implement a hotline for people to rat out their neighbors. But if your point is that Donald Trump's own COVID policies were far too authoritarian and far too deferential to a so-called expert class that ended up being horrifically wrong time after time about COVID, and in fact may have contributed to the creation of COVID in the first place by funding dangerous, reckless experimentation in China, yes, I agree with you. I don't approve at all whatsoever of Trump's handling of COVID either, and I have no particular eagerness to see him return to the White House because of that. So yeah, make no mistake, I am not at all satisfied with how Trump handled the pandemic. He put Fauci in charge of it, did nothing about that, and he's vulnerable on that issue. That's why someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has won to his side some people who were otherwise Trump supporters but said, you know what, Republicans really lost the plot on COVID. They gave in to authoritarianism. They deferred to the expert judgment and are not trustworthy on that. So I totally agree with you on that specifically. But you know, I just have to look at Walz's record as governor of a state during COVID, and I would not want to live under this person's rule, given what went on. And also then the nursing home deaths is a particularly bad thing. I was surprised in my research to find him defending that policy, which was implemented in several states, that is he said it was not a mistake, it was clearly a mistake. You sent sick people into nursing homes, spread death. That happened in Michigan as well. It happened in New York as well. In New York, Cuomo paid the price for it because he lied about it.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah,
because I get that you think the hotline thing is an issue because no one should be able to call this in. So should people not be able to call the police when a crime is committed? The calling is what you have a problem with?
People should call the police when a crime is committed, but your neighbors having like a barbecue with 11 people instead of 10 should not be illegal. It should not be something that police get called for. It should just be mind your own business. He said that the other day in his speech. He said, in Minnesota, we mind our own business, and that's a good thing. I agree with that. I wish that was his governing ethos, but it clearly was not during COVID.
Right, and so calling, someone to come in and say, hey guys, this isn't very safe, maybe you guys should spread out, you have a problem with that. That feels authoritarian to you.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So let's go to the COVID deaths. Tim Walz never covered up COVID deaths at nursing homes, which is what Andrew Cuomo
No, he didn't cover them up. He's admitting to them and saying we did the right thing.
And that policy was also a directive from the CDC under Donald Trump. That was the official federal guidelines at the time. Tim Walz was not the only governor who allowed people who, as he explained it, stayed in the hospital, had been determined to be stable enough to go home. They live at nursing homes. Yes, they were still positive. A lot of people went home still testing positive, but they didn't require hospitalization anymore, and the hospitals were overwhelmed. Sick people who needed immediate care needed to get into those beds. So should he have forbidden people from going home? How is that individual liberty?
I mean, these are, I don't know if I would put it as an individual liberty. It was
to be able to. It was
a wrong. Well, they're living in.
The government should prevent you from going to where you live.
Well, the government should prevent you from going to where you live, but they lived in, publicly run nursing home facilities that are in many cases publicly run anyway, that are communal settings.
They were not all publicly run, no. These are private nursing homes. People pay rent.
Right, but it was the government's policy to tell the hospital that it is the best thing for you is to go back to that nursing home. Should they have forcibly detained them if they wanted to go back to the nursing home? No, but we should all recognize that policy choice resulted in rampant disease running through nursing homes and killing a lot of people who otherwise would have been remained safe, would have not caught COVID.
That's not true. So hospitals were not told by Tim Walz that he should send sick people home. If someone was ready to be discharged, they should be allowed to re-enter their nursing home. As Tim Walz put it directly, it's actually more of a risk to have old people who were already at a high risk of dying from COVID and already live in close proximity with other old people in these nursing homes. But actually being in the hospital, it's a higher risk for old people. If you're going to die in an American hospital, Walz has said, he continued, the number one thing that will kill you is hospital-acquired infections. That kills 90,000 people a year. So if their immune system is already down, they're already sick. Being present in a hospital where, again, people immediately need those beds for life-saving care, someone who does not need hospital care should be allowed to go home, right?
But the home was a place where a lot of old, vulnerable people were, who would be. That's like, but it's making the problem worse overall.
But
then all those people got sick, and then they had to take them into the hospitals and get the kind of care you're describing that we were already overrun by. So the policy was like quintessentially short-sighted, because maybe we needed to ease the pressure on the hospital beds in the moment, but then we resulted in more cases of very old people because they went back to the nursing home.
But as a libertarian, don't you think if someone didn't want to live in close quarters with other old people and risk getting COVID, they could have, in their free will, left the nursing home if they didn't want that risk of staying where they pay to live and pay rent to make their home?
I mean, I guess. I don't really think it's a libertarian issue exactly. I'm just saying I'm not talking about the legal ramifications. I'm saying it was a wrong-headed decision. And I think it's not even controversial to say it's a wrong-headed decision. I think everyone admits that it was a bad idea to tell people, you still have COVID, but you're stable, so you should go back and recover in your nursing home.
That's what everyone did during COVID.
No, I know that's what they did. It was a bad idea.
Why? It was the official medical
Because it resulted in lots of people getting killed.
And so they should have stayed in the hospital. And what about the people who would have died because they can't get access to a hospital bed? We should just turn the hospitals into elderly housing?
They should not have been sent. That's what we sent them to elderly housing.
Where should they go then?
They should have stayed in the hospital.
And then what about someone who needs immediate care for life-saving? What if you have a heart attack and you can't
But you ended up with more people who needed immediate care, because by putting them back in the nursing home, you got tons more people sick. It spread the infection.
What should they have done?
They should not have done that.
What should they have done?
They should have kept them in the hospital until they were negative.
And what about the people who would have died because they can't access the necessary?
We're just going in circles. There were more of those people because more of those people got sick because they were in nursing homes.
No.
Yes, it is. It spread the infection.
To prevent access for people who need immediate care, COVID wasn't the only thing people were being hospitalized for. People have cancer, people have heart attacks, people have emergencies.
What are you saying? We put people in mass. We put children who were at almost no risk from COVID in mass for years. We were willing to do that, but we weren't willing to find alternative accommodations other than old folks' home for sick people. Are you kidding me? It makes no sense. That is the COVID lesson. Old people die of COVID at shockingly high rates. We don't have to mask all of society. We don't have to lock down all of society. We don't have to shut down everything. We just needed to keep old people, or especially when they all are gathered together, safe from exposure to the virus. And the policy was to put sick people who are positive for COVID in with the old people. It was the stupidest thing we possibly could have done. And with all the other elaborate lengths we went to keep cases that went naively and impossibly fighting an earthquake, because you couldn't actually do it. But we could have, in facilities where old people are gathered up, we could have kept them safe. We could have done more to keep positive cases out of those facilities than was done, than deliberately putting sick people purposefully by policy into the facility.
Robby,
that's what I'm objecting to.
Yeah. I understand that we have a lot more information now than we did at the time, and it's easy to look back and say what worked and what didn't.
Well, that's all I'm doing. I'm looking back and saying what worked and what didn't.
But we're judging Walz for his decisions as governor, which were to follow the federal regulations of Donald Trump.
I'm judging him for saying it was not a mistake. It was a mistake.
If you're going to blame Tim Walz for what he did under COVID, you can't say that his nursing home policy is his own, because he was following the regulations of the federal government with the best information they had. This was in March of 2020, in the beginning of the pandemic.
Just following orders. That's the excuse.
No, he was making decisions with the information he had, and hospitals were overflowing. There were people who were very sick who needed immediate care. and someone who's recovering from COVID, who's already had their hospital stay, could go home. It's important to note that a lot of the infections in COVID facilities were people coming in who were workers who were testing positive. That's what the data, now that we can look back, shows. It wasn't being spread among people who are coming back from the hospital, because we also know now that people with COVID-19 are infectious 1 to 2 days before and up to 8 to 10 days after symptoms begin. If someone's hospitalized for 10 days, when they come home, it's very likely they're not infectious anymore. These are old people who received care for COVID in the hospital and then were permitted to go back home to continue resting and recover, so that bed could be opened for someone whose life was potentially in danger.
My understanding was that they were sent back not when they were recovered, but when they were no longer in critical condition. They were stable condition, but they still were symptomatic and still had COVID, which is a dangerous zone to put them back with other old people.
Even with
see your
symptoms,
point,
it's 8 to 10 days.
That
is what the science shows.
Yeah, I see your point that, you know, nobody knew anything at the time, so mistakes were made and people were listened to who ended up being wrong. And I appreciate that this was not unique to Tim Walz, that this was federal guidance from people who ended up being, again, appallingly wrong. But I would just like to see it admitted that this was a mistaken policy.
You also understand hospitals are private entities, though, right? If a patient is stable, it's their standard of care that if they are stable and if they are fully able to recover at home, continue resting until they feel perfectly fine again, you're discharged from the hospital. You can opt to stay. You can say, I need more care. And that's a decision hospitals make at private entities. It sounds like what you're saying is the government should have mandated hospitals be required as a private company to keep people who didn't need immediate care in the bed when people who needed life-saving care needed beds.
The government did dramatic things to restrict our liberties, to compel us to wear masks as you walk to the table, and then you don't wear them while you eat dinner. The government compelled us to do extreme things that was largely unnecessary. The one thing that would have been useful was a more concerted effort to, call it whatever you want, protection or quarantine, to keep the actual at-risk population, very old people, separated from obviously sick people. And that was not done. That's all I'm saying.
So the government should have forcibly segregated people by age during the pandemic. Wouldn't that infringe on our liberties as well?
The government could have said, don't put positive COVID cases in with the elderly. And that would have been good guidance.
Okay, we're going to continue to suss out what the right has to say about Tim Walz. More Rising after this. So now that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is Kamala Harris's official running mate, we thought we'd turn to some reaction from the Midwest. We turned to Nebraska's Dan Osborn, who's running as an independent for Senate. He was a union president in 2021 when workers went on strike at 4 Kellogg's plants, including his own. They were able to secure a huge contract that covered all 4 plants, and there was an announcement Tuesday that one of the 4 plants will shut down in 2026 as sales are down about 4%. So Dan, thanks for coming on. Let's start with Tim Walz. We have a guy from the Midwest who has focused a lot of his political career on delivering for working and middle-class families. I'm surprised the Democrats picked this guy, but I'm pleasantly surprised. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I hate to disappoint you. I was just on News Nation, and I saw a statistic that or a poll, 71% of people don't really know much about him. And I certainly land in that 71%. Really, the only thing I know about him is he is from Nebraska, I heard. So always got to root for hometown people for sure. But otherwise, unknown to me.
So you're running for the Senate. What are you running on, and what do you think you're running as an independent? What do you think the major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are missing about the needs of working class people right now?
Yeah, well, I served in the United States Navy. I served in the Nebraska Army National Guard. Haven't always been a political guy really until corporate greed came knocking on my door. You know, the company I was working for made record profits during COVID. The CEO gave himself a $2 million raise. Then they tried to take from their workers. So we stood up for what we believed was right. And it opened my eyes to realizing that, we can really make a difference in people's lives, regular people's lives. But, this is a completely grassroots campaign. And what we're doing is we're going around talking to everybody in Nebraska. So these aren't necessarily my issues, but the top 3 issues that Nebraskans are concerned about is the economy. Number 1, people are hurting. Number 2, they're concerned about border security. Nebraska is a very big meat packing state. And number 3, it's got to be individual liberties.
So Dan, I went and talked to a bunch of workers in Nebraska, just regular people, asked what they think about your campaign. And while a lot of people question whether or not an independent can win, I think your campaign is proving that people want that. People are sick of getting a lot of campaign promises from either major party that are not made good on once they get into public office. You hired 2 different groups, one that focuses on typically, right-wing polling or polling on the right, one that focuses on polling on the left. And they came together and they found that you and Deb Fischer, the sitting senator that you're running for the seat of, are neck and neck at 42% and 42%. Is this a race that is winnable for people that are wondering if an independent can win in the Senate?
Yeah, this race is absolutely winnable. People are frustrated with both parties catering to their extremes right now. There's no Democrat in my race, so very unique in the fact it's just Republican versus independent. But you mentioned the poll. Impact Research is a Biden-Harris pollster, and we did it in conjunction with Red Wave Strategies, which is the same pollster Vivek Ramaswamy uses. So it's a very bipartisan poll, but it just it really reiterates what I already know, and that's going around talking to everyday Nebraskans that are frustrated with what they see in D.C. They're frustrated mostly with this corporate agenda that they all have and the amount of money that it takes to run for office. They're going to spend $100 million to run for office, run for Senate in Montana and Texas this year. So people are very interested in what we're talking about, which is campaign finance reform, ending Citizens United, just getting the money out of politics. Because until we do that, our issues, I'm not saying they don't matter. Of course they matter, but nothing's really going to change for us and with the government for corporations in the 1%.
It seems like we've heard from many corporate leaders that they've made their peace with Donald Trump, and at some points having an antagonistic relationship with him in the past, but he's promised, massive corporate tax cuts and has brought a lot of corporate leaders back into the fold. Actually, the market. The stock markets have not done well in the last few days, possibly because Kamala Harris has rebounded or is doing better than Joe Biden was. They're maybe afraid of her presidency, although, of course, many Democratic elites have had a cozy relationship with corporations as well. I think it can be very discouraging for working people, ordinary people, trying to even grapple with the amount of influence in money and how much power that can buy in Washington. And you also talked about a minute ago the fears that people have about individual liberties being violated. That's something always very close to my heart. Something I'm always frustrated about as a libertarian. What kind of what change do you hope to make, or what policies do you hope to be able to implement if you were to be elected?
Yeah, so you mentioned libertarian. I have a lot of libertarian viewpoints as well. I do believe a smaller government can be a better government. I always keep a copy of the Constitution here, and in the Constitution, the cover of mine, George Washington warned us of the 2 factions, and that's kind of what we got here today. And the 2 factions are controlled by corporations. My opponent, Deb Fischer, she's taken money from Facebook, Boeing, the meat packers here, the Class 1 railroads, and she does their bidding. So for me, we've raised over $2 million. We've out-fundraised Deb Fischer in the second quarter. My average donation is $35. I'm not taking a dime of corporate money because I don't want to be a part of the problem. I want to be a part of the solution. But, I talked about the economy and that being top on Nebraska's list. That's something we really have to focus on and stop kicking the can down the road. And both parties, all administrations have been guilty of adding $5 to $7 trillion to the debt. I think the first thing we need to do is we need to clean our own house. You look at the Department of Defense has never passed a federal audit. They actually have, from what I understand, over $30 trillion in unaccounted for assets. $30 trillion. Our national debt's $36 trillion. So, these are staggering figures that we have to do a hard reset, and we have to hold, these government agencies accountable for their budgets. And that's where it starts. And then, we have to do a deep dive into corporate gouging. $250 used to fill my grocery cart up for a family of 5. Now it barely skims the bottom. It's frustrating times for people. Taxes, everything's just going up so quickly. Me as a mechanic, I'm not a rich guy. It's definitely hitting home with me. And, this is the richest country in the world. But we have to have that reverse that transfer of wealth that we've seen in this country of $50 trillion from 90% of Americans to the top 1% of Americans. We got to figure that part out.
Dan, I have to ask this as a daughter of America's working class with a dad who's in his 60s and still working with his hands to provide for the family. You are someone who's not a typical politician. You are not a lawyer. You are not someone who had a career in politics. You're a steam fitter. You're a union guy. You still work with your hands while you're on the campaign trail. Deb Fischer, for contrast, some of her top donors are railroad companies. And the largest rail yard in the world is in your home state, her home state of Nebraska, where she represents. There's a bit of a conflict of interest there, and a lot of workers I talk to in Nebraska are not happy with her not supporting things like the Railroad Safety Act. Can you just speak to how your experience as a working man influences how you would represent people in Congress?
Yeah, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, if you lean left or you lean right. I get along with the majority of people that I come in contact with because I am them, right? I understand the value of 8 hours hard work for 8 hours pay. I know what it's like to have to put Christmas on a credit card. When you talked about the railroads, I did an event in Columbus, Nebraska, at one of the oldest taverns here in the state, and there's a rail line that goes right by it, and a train was coming by in the middle of my talk, and I stopped right there and I said, "This is why we have to pass the Rail Safety Act." I mean, if one of those cars were to derail that close to a city center like that, Columbus has like 27,000 people. It's not a super small town. But it would be devastating. We've had 4 derailments here in Nebraska in just the last 2 months. One of them very close to an anhydrous plant. So until we can pass these safety measures, and Deb Fischer sat on the transportation committee that allowed them to police their own safety, and they actually have death factored into their safety program as acceptable, and that's not acceptable to me. We have to keep our citizens safe. And that's sometimes you have to put people over profit. It's a hard pill to swallow for corporations that don't understand that concept.
Dan Osborn, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Elon Musk is taking a group of advertisers to court. Musk alleges that a, quote, massive advertiser boycott lost his company, X, billions of dollars in revenue and violated antitrust laws. X filed this suit in a Texas federal court against the World Federation of Advertisers and member companies, including CVS Health, Unilever, Mars, and Orsted. It accused the advertising group's brand safety initiative, the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, of helping to coordinate a pause in advertisers after Musk bought Twitter. On Twitter, Musk wrote, quote, "We tried being nice for 2 years and got nothing but empty words. Now it's war." Musk was reacting to a judge ruling that Google is a monopolist and violated antitrust laws. This is what the CEO of X, Linda Yaccarino, had to say. Let's watch.
Hey, everybody. I was shocked by the evidence uncovered by the House Judiciary Committee that a group of companies organized a systematic illegal boycott against X. It is just wrong, and that is why we are taking action. Today, we filed an antitrust lawsuit against the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, 4 of its key members, and the World Federation of Advertisers. These organizations targeted our company and you, our users. The evidence and facts are on our side. They conspired to boycott X, which threatens our ability to thrive in the future. That puts your global town square, the one place that you can express yourself freely and openly, at long-term risk. People are hurt when the marketplace of ideas is constricted. No small group of people should be able to monopolize what gets monetized.
The lawsuit is the latest effort by X to restore its ad business that tanked when Musk took over. So, boycotts are generally covered under First Amendment freedoms, the freedom of speech. Kind of hilarious that Musk talks about free speech all of the time but wants to sue people over a boycott. I'm curious about the antitrust angle of this lawsuit. Is this an anti-competitive action? Because these are consumers of advertisements. They purchase ad space. So they're not competing for ad space. So this idea that this is somehow antitrust, I looked at what one of the FTC antitrust attorneys was saying, and they said it's a hideous joke. The antitrust laws, essentially don't apply here. And it's not a question as to whether or not Twitter lost money. The question here is whether Twitter was competitively disadvantaged by their actions. And there's just no evidence in this complaint they were competitively disadvantaged. If people don't want to buy advertisements there, you can't force them to.
Yeah, I mostly agree with what you just said. I mean, Twitter was harmed by the decision, this conglomerate of advertisers that work in concert and decided not to be on Twitter did harm Twitter. However, there's no right you don't have some right for advertisers to work with you. Advertisers can make it ends up being a First Amendment issue, as you just alluded to, can make the decision not to advertise on your website. You can't compel someone to do business with you to advertise on your website. If you could, that would violate the First Amendment. So I think this effort is very much doomed and is not a good idea. I think calling to attention the coordinated efforts of not so much, and also focusing on like CVS itself is totally wrong. The advertisers are not consciously making these choices. They have devolved their decision making to third-party advertising, overseeing safety watchdog type groups like the Anti-Defamation League and like Media Matters, who came up with these, in my view, totally wrong-headed idea that X is a uniquely harassing, bad place, that there was so much hate and it was getting worse, and they used very bad metrics to demonstrate that. And that persuaded the groups that speak on behalf of the advertisers not to work with these companies. They should be called out. They should be exposed. If it ends up being where it's like, the disinformation trackers, that it's State Department funded, that should be desubsidized. But at the end of the day, you can't compel CVS to advertise on X if it doesn't want to. If it's deciding not to advertise on X based on a faulty premise or based on information that is bad, that information can be corrected in the public square, should be corrected. If people have slandered X or made slanderous claims, they can be sued for that. But you can't sue a company for not advertising on your website at the end of the day. Obviously, you can't. So yeah. It's not an effort that's going to succeed.
Yeah, I think as much as, CVS can be influenced, this is a huge company that can make its own decisions around where they advertise. And if they wanted to advertise on X and, the Global Alliance of Responsible Media said, we have some concerns about X, they could still decide to do so. This is not a binding relationship.
Right. But they've outsourced, the companies have largely outsourced this decision making to third-party watchdog organizations that I find to be wrong-headed and ideological. So it's more a point about educating the advertisers about who they're, like Media Matters and the Anti-Defamation League and other disinformation tracking groups, and this conglomerate that's this Brussels-based organization that it's a board representing them that gets together and says, oh, we've decided it's unsafe to be on Twitter. And I'm saying, well, what is that? What is your information? Where are you getting that information? How are you quantifying unsafe? And that's where I think a lot of the assumptions were faulty. Again, that's not so much on the advertisers. I think with better information, they would not necessarily choose not to advertise on X. But whether they choose to or not is not a legal matter, is not a point on which they can be sued, obviously.
Right, yeah. Companies in the past have been hurt by advertising on websites that are allowing misinformation to run rampant. So, yeah, if there's a company that's tracking where there's a lot of misinformation and they're saying, hey guys, if you don't want your ad to run on a video, that might be about whether or not the shooting in Sandy Hook was real and it's an Alex Jones video. A lot of people say, why is this company advertising on this video? And it can hurt the company. So it's a business decision at the end of the day.
But a lot of that kind of tracking, that's the exact kind of tracking I'm getting at, because some of that is misguided. For instance, I've called attention to this many times on Rising, so forgive viewers if you've heard this one before. But for instance, the magazine I write for, Reason, we were put on some list with some more conservative sites of unsafe websites that this fact-checking organization, the Global Disinformation Index, wanted you not to advertise on our site. And one of the reasons for that was they said we were spreading, or another site, they accused us of the Washington Examiner maybe, was spreading racist misinformation about COVID by having run an op-ed by someone who said COVID probably came from a lab. So they are fact-checking. They were saying you're unsafe and advertisers should not work with you because you featured commentary of someone taking the opinion that COVID came from a lab. So that is a incorrect fact check, I would argue. That is not misinformation. The organization doing that is acting in bad faith or is wrong-headed. So advertisers should not take their cues from that organization. If an advertiser decides not to be on the Washington Examiner, again, it could be, you can't sue the advertiser for not doing that. What you can do is call out the organization that caused them to make that mistake. And that's where I think the focus should be.
Right. So this lawsuit is essentially baseless. But do you think Elon Musk made the decision to move to Texas because he's more likely to get a judge that is friendly to his arguments? Or rather, the laws will be applied in a way in this case that it's more friendly to X?
Yeah, I have no idea if his residence changes where the case. I just don't know that aspect of it. That's a good question. That's interesting. I don't think. I think this case will not go well for him because, as we've pointed out, you can't. It's just pretty ironclad that the advertiser has a First Amendment right not to do business with you. Yeah, maybe you get a judge who creatively rules differently. Republicans have been embracing a more broader understanding of antitrust. They were just really excited about this Google decision the other day that we argued about, and I actually ended up arguing it with Amber Duke, our Fridays co-host. I do a show with her on Reason once a week, and we had the same argument that you and I had. So it's a rare situation where you and her would have agreed, and I would have disagreed. The conservatives have embraced more of the antitrust agenda in a way that I actually think is very damaging to some of their other first principles. But we'll see if they find a Republican judge who will buy what Elon Musk is selling here.
Yes.
I think not.
Anti-monopoly when it hurts companies.
Right.
A monopoly of consumers. Okay, sorry.
More Rising right after this. A Democratic-aligned group is fighting to deny RFK Jr. ballot access in New York State. Now that group, Clear Choice, a Democratic PAC, is attempting to make the case that the New York address RFK Jr. listed is not his real home, and thus the 45,000 signatures he collected in order to obtain ballot access in New York are invalid.
RFK Jr. is struggling to stay on the ballot in New York, but it seems all anyone can talk about is the bear he dumped in Central Park a decade ago. Kennedy, who says he found the cub roadside and put it in the park as a prank, seemed to understand the story wasn't going to go over well in the media. The news and Kennedy's video reaction to it overshadowed his court case that began Monday in Albany. There, a group of voters tried to remove him from the ballot, arguing Kennedy falsely claimed to live in New York. The case is being backed by Democrat-aligned PAC Clear Choice, who is hoping to get Kennedy off the ballot. For context, back in May, the Kennedy campaign said it turned in more than enough signatures to get on the New York State's ballot, but lawyers for the 4 voters who brought the case argue Kennedy's nominating petition listed a residence in a New York City suburb, while Kennedy actually lives in Los Angeles. Kennedy's New York petitions list an address in Katonah, New York. Lawyers say that address is the home of one of Kennedy's friends, not his, and therefore the signatures are not valid.
Kennedy's lawyer said in a statement that his mail is delivered in Katona, plus his driver's, fishing, and falconry licenses are all from New York. Under state election law, the judge is set to decide the case without a jury. Kennedy's campaign has said he has enough signatures to qualify in 42 states so far.
Kennedy is trying to fight back against all the negative media coverage, writing on X, quote, "To the mainstream media, every time you write, quote, roadkill, I will mention dirty CIA regime change wars and our $35 trillion debt. Every time you write barbecued goat, I will invoke normalized government censorship. And the more you smear me, the more I'll keep speaking."
Yeah, so look, I criticized RFK Jr. earlier this week for exercising obvious bad judgment years ago with this whole bear situation that I think he knows was not a good decision. But that is neither here nor there in terms of him being denied ballot access. Let's be very clear about what's happening here. Democrats, a Democratic aligned PAC, a PAC aligned with the Democratic Party that says the state of affairs is an existential threat to democracy, is using anti-democratic means to stop you from being able to vote for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. based on an absolute technicality that should not matter whatever. Who cares where his mail is delivered, where he has his falconry license? He doesn't need to establish residency to run. It's not like he doesn't actually live in the district and so he can't run there. He's trying to be on the ballot in the state of New York as he is should be on the ballot in every state in the country. The requirements to get on the ballot are very difficult if you're not already part of one of the two major established political parties or even part of the third parties, which are able to have not as easy a time as the Republicans or Democrats, but an easier time than an independent candidate, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party. So RFK Jr. has had quite a task, and he's doing that task. And the idea that you would disqualify him on this utter slight technicality, these are dirty tricks being pulled by Democrats who are afraid of him being on the ballot, afraid that I guess the people who were otherwise might have voted for Kamala are going to vote for RFK Jr., even though the data doesn't really bear that out. But it's just rank hypocrisy, gamesmanship, very, very, very bad, and shame on them for doing it.
Right. There's something to be said for, yes, you have a home state advantage if you're from the state, but no one's looking at the filings with the Secretary of State in New York and saying like, oh, this guy's from New York, I'll vote for him.
Yeah, that doesn't matter.
The home state advantage comes from people knowing you and your work in the state. And so I think it is silly and it feels wrong to see a PAC using this tactic to try and get someone off the ballot. I understand that lying about where you live is a problem, but in this case, if they have enough signatures to get on the ballot, they should be on the ballot. But just talking about signatures necessary to get on the ballot, that is an arduous process.
Yes.
That the secretary,
costs money.
It costs a ton of money that a lot of independent candidates don't have. It absolutely favors the two-party system because typically the Secretary of State is a Republican or a Democrat. And they're going to look at independent candidates running for office. They have a lot of reasons for why they don't want to run against independents, and they're more likely to disqualify signatures, to question their authenticity. This is something that AOC struggled with when she was running against the party machine in major ways in New York. And so I think it's even a problem within the party during the primary process, not just when an independent candidate like RFK Jr. is running. So I think it's sad to see, PACs put their political power in something like this when they could just be, argue against his message, promote your message. I think that's a more honest way of campaigning. So this is the dirty side of politics in my eyes.
Yeah, great points. You have to get, if you're an independent candidate, you have to get approval. You have to dot all your I's, cross all your T's, do everything exactly perfectly correct because you ultimately are going to be subject to the scrutiny of people who are part of the two-party system, who's the only thing they can agree on is that we're going to keep this a fight between Republicans and Democrats because that's the ground they're comfortable keeping the fight on. So if there is any reason to cast aside a signature, a petition signature from an independent candidate, they can take that option. And so this is a technicality they found. It is exceedingly silly. It is difficult. It costs money. It takes time he could spend campaigning. Instead, he has to spend collecting signatures or starting up a petition drive, an organization that can do that. It takes time, money, and resources. And now they're going to end up in court fighting about this. So it's crystal clear. It should just be allowed that he should. Of course, he should be on the ballot. Like the end result is what. So then you won't have the option to vote for him for this reason, or you have to write his name in. It's really a sham.
Yeah, I think that.
Other things that rhyme with am.
Yeah, there should be a process for getting on the ballot that requires some indication there is support that people want to vote for you in the state, right? Mm-hmm. We can't just let anyone who wants to run for office get their name on the ticket, and then we spend so much money printing these very long ballots that look like
looks like a CVS receipt. Oh,
so I think that,
we don't want it to look like a CVS receipt. Although we should default. I think it should default to being.
It doesn't need to be thousands of signatures.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Maybe just a few in each major county, something like that, something that's manageable in a weekend of work.
It would be better.
You should verify the identities of who signs up, which is why it's such a long process, why it's so expensive. But it doesn't need to be as many names as they require.
It would be better, in my view, it would be more democratic to lean toward having too many names on the ballot because the process is too simple than having too few names on the ballot because the process is really time-consuming and expensive, right? Mm-hmm. If we're thinking about this in democratic fashion, I understand there need to be some set of standards so that you don't have, and you're looking out for duplicates. I've known in local races sometimes someone will wants to find a person and get them to run who has a similar name to their opponent, so that there's two of the same looking names on the ballot. That kind of stuff happens in local politics all the time.
Well, fun fact.
Dirty stuff.
There was a very successful Nebraska football coach called Dan Osborn with an E at the end. And there is a chance people vote for Dan believing he was that very winning Nebraska football coach, which is a very funny advantage that Dan Osborn has in Nebraska. I don't think that will credit his winning.
Who we interviewed, by the way, today on Rising,
in
an upcoming segment that we've released today. Please check that interview out.
But I want to also mention, in the state of New York, I lived in New York for a few years. It's the state where I first turned 18 where I was living. The way their ballots are organized is by party. There's like columns for each party. There's a working families sort of line, and a lot of people sort of vote down the line. And if you're not with any of the major parties in New York, you don't get that same amount of prominence on the ticket. So where you're positioned in the ballot, there's some research that shows it matters. And I think it's a little bit weird that it's a part of our democracy that the more you invest in the political process, the more prominent you can be on a ballot. And I just don't like when there's that trade-off of money into the electoral process. I don't know, we could say, the political and industrial system or what have you, but I think we spend way too much money on elections and politics, and the fact that you have to invest more to have a more favorable position is just a little bit icky to me. And so RFK Jr. should be on the ballot. He's a weird guy. I think he got the brain worm maybe from eating bear meat or something, but make advertisements about that as a PAC. Don't try and get him off the ballot on a technicality.
Yes, icky indeed. More Rising right after this. Squad member Cori Bush has lost her re-election effort, falling in the primary in Missouri. She had this to say about her loss, taking aim at AIPAC, which funded her opponent significantly. Let's watch.
Pulling me away from my position as Congresswoman. All you did was take some of the strings off. Now I don't have to worry about some strings that I have attached, and as much as I love my job. But all they did was radicalize me, and so now they be afraid.
So she's not happy about her loss.
No, she's not happy about her loss. Wesley Bell is someone who had a pro-Israel group, AIPAC, very well known, spent $8.5 million to oust her in this election. And she's not happy, rightfully so, that a foreign entity can spend so much money influencing U.S. politics. I always say that if this was Russia or China, this would be very bad. This has been widely reported as Cori Bush says that she's now turning her attention to tearing down, the Jewish kingdom, which is not what she said. She said AIPAC, and a lot of people have mistaken, criticizing Israel and criticizing the United States, bolstering the IDF and Israel's military and supporting their war on Gaza as being anti-Semitic. It's very different to criticize a foreign government and their influence over U.S. politics from making statements about the Jewish faith and the Jewish people. So I think we should be very careful about how we address this from Cori.
Yeah, I have no disagreement with you there. I saw some person who posted the speech online and then posted it with the caption, a quote, "American Jews, I am coming for you," and then which is a really vile and incendiary thing to say. Watch the clip. We just played it for you. She does not in any place say that exact quote. What she says is that I'm coming for you, AIPAC. I'm coming for your kingdom. You can have whatever view of her you want. You can think she's unhinged, as I kind of do a little bit, in terms of as I called attention, her faith healing remarks that she wrote about in her book. Her thinks she has the magical ability to heal people's tumors, but we should be accurate in reporting what she said. She did not actually say the statement that American Jews, I'm coming for you, and so that was a very unfair smear. What she did face was, yes, a lot of funding for AIPAC for her opponent, and yes, she lost.
Right, and she's also not the first black woman who ran for Congress. Senator Nina Turner of Ohio is another, contender of the progressive movement who was ousted by a candidate bankrolled by AIPAC. And there's something to be said for this happening over and over. And this amount of money being spent on races to oust people, especially when it happens in primaries, is just really ridiculous. Couldn't that money be better spent, pushing the Democratic agenda, pushing candidates that are strong to win in maybe red districts? I think if you're a Democrat and you care about Democrats winning, you should question why so much money is being put in primaries to oust actually very popular national figures in the Democratic Party. Cori Bush, protested outside of the Capitol, slept outside because there was about to be an end to the moratorium on evictions during COVID. Many people lost their jobs and couldn't pay rent, and it was seemingly unsafe to have them pushed out of their homes. She got that done. She came to Congress as a Ferguson protester, and she brought those values to Congress. She was very vocal, one of the first House members, representatives, to call for a ceasefire in Gaza.
Well, her opponent has a similar origin story in terms of the Ferguson stuff, if I am correct on that.
In 2022, it's important to also note Cori Bush withheld her vote on the Democratic budget until they funded transit repairs for flooding. So when St. Louis was destroyed by flooding, there were videos of Cori Bush with her constituents in their basement showing the damage and the flooding that they endured. She understands what people in her district are going through, and she fights for it, and she won $214 million for communities to address this impact of the flooding. I think that's huge, and I think losing someone like Cori Bush because there's a foreign government that wants to influence our politics is really sad.
Yeah. I think, though, the evidence is probably that she was just a little too radical, progressive, and left-leaning for the district she was in, or that her antics people thought were embarrassing. Again, the belief in magic, paying for a lot of security while taking the position that defunding the police was a good idea, and so on and so forth. So this is the second squad member to go down to defeat. Jamal Bowman also lost a primary challenge, also faced AIPAC money funding his opponent. So certainly many progressives are going to feel like, having picked this fight with the pro-Israel lobby ended up being an issue that hurt them. Now, of course, AIPAC also ran ads against, on the Republican side, they ran ads against Thomas Massie, who, won his primary challenge dramatically. It had absolutely no effect. I think he actually even liked that someone was calling attention to the fact that he was unwilling to spend American tax dollars abroad. It's like a commercial for him because that's a very popular opinion actually among the Republican base, which is something the elites don't understand. But it's certainly made an impact on the Democratic side, the funding here.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for it took $20.5 million to unseat Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, $8.5 million in Cori Bush's case, $12 million in Jamal Bowman's case, coming from AIPAC. Now, if these two squad members, progressive members of the House, were ousted because their ideas were unpopular simply, and the progressive vision's not popular among regular people, it wouldn't take $20.5 million to get them out. Also, they both defeated very centrist, very establishment Democrats. Eliot Engel in Jamal Bowman's case. When they were first elected to their position. They were running on progressive values after the district was represented by very establishment candidates. Eliot Engel in Jamal Bowman's case. William Lacey Clay in Cori Bush's case. So if the values and the ideas were not popular, they wouldn't have gotten elected.
I mean, I think it's a little naive to say that when the progressives win, it's because everyone loves progressive ideas, and when they lose, it's because it's unfair. People spent too much money running against us. I don't know. That seems...
When you win on ideas and on grassroots efforts because people in your district believe in your campaign and are organizing for you, that's very different from someone winning who's backed by a ton of money. That takes actual support of people on the ground, not just billionaire
money doesn't
donors.
buy, what do they do with that? Money doesn't buy votes. Money calls to attention the unpopular things about the person. Generally,
they can run
true
attack
things.
Ads that are,
well,
they
attack
don't
ads
have
are
to
not
be
untrue.
Truthful. They don't have to be truthful. No, they can be misleading. And
they can be They can be truthful but misleading.
Right, and you can sue afterwards, but they can lie, and unless you have the money for a lawsuit, you're
did
not
anyone
be able to sue them. So
did anyone literally lie about her? Did they make some claim that is like an outright lie about her? Or did they just call attention to some of the kooky stuff she said and done?
They said that she's anti-Semitic. They put pictures of her out that were doctored, that stretched her face out in a way that made her look different. People said that that was racist and they were creating racist caricatures of her. There were many things that they did that were just very dirty in this campaign and very misleading. And so when someone can afford $8.5 million in the case of Cori Bush, $12 million in the case of Jamal Bowman, you can pay for a lot of information to reach people with these attack ads. And if that's all they're getting, of course that can influence an election. It's not buying votes, but it's the next closest thing.
All right, well, we will continue following any developments there, and we will have more Rising right after this. CNN's political commentator Van Jones had an interesting reaction to Kamala Harris's running mate's pick of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz over Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. Let's watch.
The conservatives, the right wing, the Republicans, they were chewing their fingernails down to the knuckle because they were afraid of a Josh Shapiro. They were afraid of a Mark Kelly. They're not as afraid of this new governor because they think they can define him. So here's the challenge you've got in this party. And people don't want to talk about it. We got to talk about it. On the one hand, you have a lot of young people who are concerned about Gaza. You have a lot of Muslims and Arabs and others. They have not felt seen by the Biden administration. You start hearing that genocide joke. That was building. And so those folks needed to have a candidate that they could feel comfortable with. This helps them in that regard. But you also have anti-Semitism that has gotten marbled into this party. You can be for the Palestinians without being an anti-Jewish bigot, but there are some anti-Jewish bigots out there. And there's some disquiet now, and there has to be. How much of what just happened is caving into some of these darker parts in the party? So that's going to have to get worked out. It's going to have to get talked through.
So that's interesting. Van Jones certainly seems to think it was maybe anti-Semitic. It was maybe because of Josh Shapiro's Jewish identity, that there are elements of the Democratic Party who are not just critical of Israel or critical of its government, as Josh Shapiro himself was. He's been very critical of Netanyahu, but are making the party an inhospitable place for Jews themselves.
Very weird to call this part of the party like the darker parts of the Democratic Party. These are people who want folks to have health care, who want folks to have housing, who don't want U.S. resources going to fund endless wars in the Middle East. There's nothing dark about that vision for America. And Donald Trump's kind of on beat with this as well. On Fox this morning, he called in and he said that this pick is insulting to the Jewish people. This idea that Shapiro was not picked because he's Jewish is a bit ridiculous when, again, Kamala Harris's own husband is Jewish, and he doesn't have as much experience as Tim Walz. He's only been a governor for a year. He doesn't have as much of a track record there. When he was in the interviews, there are some reports coming from both his camp and people on the Harris side saying that it wasn't a good interview, that he has ambitions to become the president. That seems to be pretty clear. He's not someone that is focused on the role she needs him for, which is vice president. And he turned some of his campaign rallies into, here's my track record, Josh Shapiro, PA governor, and here's her track record, when he was supposed to be campaigning for Harris. And so there were some red flags there, and it was a pick based on his actions and his merits.
Well, yeah, if the red flags were he was going to steal the show from her, I think that is possibly accurate because he was a very appealing candidate in his own right, and Kamala Harris is someone that was foisted on us by Democratic Party elites at the last minute and has not had to go through an actual primary nominating process this time around and is just being crammed down our throats by the media, and was fearful that someone who won elected office in a very purple state, a state that's gone red in 2016, blue in 2020, and who has the approval of a lot of Republicans in the state, centrists and moderates, might overshadow her. So instead, she's going with someone who, has certainly advantages of his own in that he makes progressives very happy. He does have more experience and a longer track record in government than Shapiro does at the executive level. I think that I'm not thrilled with that record. People can watch my radar today to see what I think about his time in office during the pandemic. But at the end of the day, no one knows exactly why Kamala Harris made the choice she made, except for Kamala Harris, and she doesn't have to explain it any more than that. It's her pick. It might have been a personality thing. It might have been she just got along better with Tim Walz or whatever it is. Maybe Josh Shapiro wanted to stick it out, actually. He's new to being governor of Pennsylvania and thought he should be better off finishing off his term. Could be a variety of things.
Kamala Harris explained why she picked Tim Walz at her campaign event yesterday.
Well, yeah, but the actual reason, who knows?
I think she was being honest about the reason she picked him, but saying that Shapiro would steal the show is a bit silly because he doesn't have as much of a track record. She would overshadow him. She has far more experience in public life than him, but if he's so focused on talking about himself, that's going to distract from what's your vision for the country? What's the Harris administration going to do? That's a liability on the campaign trail. You don't want someone who's egocentric to be on the ticket. And so someone like Walz, who's focused on the future of the country, focused on winning this election, not a future election for president, he said he has no ambitions to run. He's focused on how do we deliver for
We're just taking everybody at their utter and complete and absolute word here.
Yeah, absolutely. He says he doesn't want to run for president. I believe him at that. Yeah.
Okay. I think he might very well run for president. I don't care if he does. It's fine. She should be free to pursue the presidency, as virtually every person who has occupied the position of vice president has done at some point in the last 40 years.
He would be ready to serve if he had to, but his words, which he offered up without being prompted, was, I have no ambitions to ever run for president. So if something happens to Kamala Harris, sure, that's the job of the vice president. He can step up and serve, but he doesn't want to run.
If by something happens, Democratic elites decide at the very last minute, without any sort of democratic process or primary process, that they will swap her out for someone else, he would be ready to serve? Is that what you're saying?
Well, if Kamala Harris decided to step down because she was experiencing cognitive decline, yes, it would be the vice president who takes over. That's how the Constitution lays it out, Robby.
And has the vice president taken over during this cognitive decline under the constitutional process for having a president be incapacitated and removed by his cabinet and replaced with the vice president? Have we done that?
Biden,
we have not done that. He has stepped down from running for president. He's not stepped down from the presidency. So
I get that you want that, Robby, because you have different political agenda for the country. But Joe Biden,
No. I'm not the one here who's forcing my political agenda on the country. I'm not a supporter of Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Donald Trump or J.D. Vance or Tim Walz or any of these people. I'm just trying to call it like I see it.
Sure,
and
Robby.
if he's not he's not capable of running for president, I don't think he's capable of being the president right now. That's my controversial
You know,
hot
in the
take.
spirit of taking everyone at their word, I believe you, Robby. But the point is Joe Biden, in his old age, doing 2 jobs, campaigning full-time and serving as president of the United States, it was a decision he made that it's too much for him. You know, he's finishing out his term, and Kamala Harris is our pick. It's something that the majority of people in the country supported and the majority of Democrats supported. Tim Walz being the pick, I think, is a good decision. He's the kind of guy that's going to win in red districts, and just because he's not Jewish, Jewish people should not be insulted by the ticket, as Donald Trump said. It's just grasping at straws to say that picking Tim Walz over someone who is Jewish is insulting to the Jewish community. That's like saying picking a white guy over a black woman is insulting to the black community. And it's the same people that are mad about DEI that are saying that this is insulting.
Yeah, again, I don't like DEI stuff. I don't think he should have been picked because he was Jewish. I think he should have been picked because he's the popular governor of the pivotal swing state. I think if Tim Walz was the governor of Pennsylvania and was as popular with Republicans and moderates in Pennsylvania as Josh Shapiro is, it would make absolute sense to pick him independent of their other political positions.
Well,
but it's fine. They picked whoever they picked. It's fine.
Call it like you see it, Robby. What do you make of the pick being insulting to the Jewish people? Trump's statement.
I think they are saying that because of the idea they have that he was passed over because of the radical pro-Palestinian activists not wanting someone, not because he's Jewish, I disagree with that, but because he is perceived, I'm not sure correctly, as being more pro-Israel than the alternatives, even though they all have the same policies, and Kamala Harris is extremely pro-Israel and just as pro-Israel as Biden.
So we have Tim Walz, who served 24 years in the National Guard, and then we have Josh Shapiro, who literally served in the IDF.
I mean,
I don't. For a Ford.
Well, now we're switching to like, who do you prefer? I was making who do I think was the better choice in terms of Kamala Harris winning the election, and I think the choice was pretty clearly Josh Shapiro. In terms of who is more who has more military service, I don't care about that. I don't like.
It's objective.
Tim Walz's. No, it's not objective. It's completely subjective.
You didn't even let me finish what I was saying.
Right.
It is objective to say that someone who served in the IDF is more pro-Israel than someone who has not. Right?
I think Josh Shapiro is more pro-Israel than.
So then
Tim
it's
Walz.
not just the perception of the pro-Palestinian.
I mean, I think he's more pro-Israel, although I think his policies
for sure
make no difference. He favors the same policies as Kamala Harris and Tim Walz with respect to Israel, right? Do any of those people disagree on whether Israel should be supported and funded by the U.S.? I don't think so. Do they disagree on Netanyahu? No, they all think Netanyahu is bad. They all sort of want a ceasefire, but are not really willing to push for it, right? They all have the same
Shapiro
policies.
has made multiple statements favoring Netanyahu when people were protesting Israel's actions. Josh Shapiro equated them to KKK protesters.
But that has nothing to do with Netanyahu.
And Tim Walz, no, but Josh Shapiro has made statements in favor of Netanyahu many times throughout his political career. He also served in the IDF. That is something that cannot be forgotten. But Tim Walz is someone, when uncommitted voters were casting ballots in primaries, he said, I think that's good. I think it's good they voiced their concerns. That's very different from calling the pro-Palestine movement and the movement critical of Israel the KKK. They're very different on the issue.
All right, if you say so. That does it for us today on Rising, and it is just Wednesday. What a long week. We shall be back here delivering more news, more friendly debate for you to consume. Hope you're enjoying it.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while you're on the go, we are available wherever you get your podcasts.
Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.